Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast today about the Texas Legislature, our weekly Texas Legislative update here with Jason Modglin, who is the president of the Texas Energy Alliance. Jason, how are you doing today?
I'm good, David. How are you, sir?
Just great. Just great. I bet you had a busy week in Austin this week, huh?
It was a busy week. Members were really catching up on a week lost at the legislature. So with the ice storm in Austin and Central Texas, most of the activity last week was shut down or severely curtailed. We had 4 solid days of no bill filings, which is just unheard of during the early part of the legislative session. So they're making up time pretty quick, and bill filings are starting to jump up here pretty fast.
Yeah, and I guess I should have started by apologizing for us not doing this last week, but the ice also interfered with our own schedules, and we ended up not being able to get together last Friday to do this.
Well,
But
we thought about pushing to Monday, and
right,
as you remember, Monday is the busiest day by far around the legislative season, and so we just couldn't make it work Monday. So apologies for that.
Yeah, no, I do remember those Mondays quite well. I probably had 4 different meetings just outside the Capitol to do every Monday during a session. So much less going over there to talk to anybody. And just staying on that, the subject of that ice storm last week. It wasn't really a Winter Storm Uri severe event, but it was a pretty significant cold snap and ice storm that impacted really about 2/3 of the state in one way or another. And we went through that without a glitch on the Texas electric grid, despite a completely false report that was filed on last Friday by Newsweek. I really can't even understand how that got past their editorial checks. And so I wonder what you think, what effect this might have. I mean, we've now the grid has really performed well through 2 winters and a very severe summer last July, especially when the heat was really severe in the Texas summer without any major, I mean, we've had a glitch here and there and days when we came close but didn't quite get to any kinds of rolling blackouts. I wonder, what do you think? How does that impact, if at all, what kind of legislation might be able to get done in this year's session to, further reforms to the system?
That's definitely the case, that there is an undercurrent of what more needs to change to the energy only electric market now that we've met some pretty incredible new records in terms of demand last summer. And then some exceptional winter demands on the electricity grid this winter and now early spring. And last week was really a kind of a unique situation in terms of local distribution impacts. So I'm in Central Texas, and the city of Austin had some major disruptions that may result in some leadership changes, both at the city level, but also at the local utility level.
But to be clear, that's not part of the grid, right? Austin Energy
that's
is
right.
separate.
That's
from
right.
the grid.
Yeah. So that's entirely kind of local management, whether it's vegetative management, burying lines, the redundancies that are necessary to make sure that even if you do have those localized impacts, that power can still flow. And there were a substantial number of Austinites that were out of power for multiple days, really in the core downtown area, not downtown, but just north of downtown, where there's quite a few residential communities. They were severely impacted.
It's funny.
I do think that undercurrent basically is working against those advocating for additional fees, additional cost evaluations to then attract more investment.
Yeah, it was funny. I read that Newsweek piece. I don't know if you saw it, but I mean, even in the headline, it talked about major grid glitches put pressure on Abbott. And I'm like, there weren't any major grid glitches. I actually wrote to the editors at Newsweek asking them for a correction. And I've been pretty critical of Governor Abbott and Austin officials in general about the grid since that big problem 2 years ago. But the reality is the reforms that were enacted 2 years ago have done a lot of good and corrected a lot. I mean, I still think we have and others, I think, agree that we have a pretty significant lack of dispatchable thermal capacity, to fill in real, or winter storm Uri kinds of events.
That's right.
But otherwise, man, it's hard to think of what on the system really needs fixing at this point, right?
Well, that's absolutely true. But we are going to have retirements. That's certainly going to be the case over the next 10 years. And as we talked about in kind of the first episode with the governor swearing in, he wanted to look not only at the next 4 years, but also the next 40 years. And so what is that energy mix going to look like? There's no doubt, unfortunately, that we're going to have a lot more wind and solar into the state, mainly solar. They've kind of maxed out. They've maxed out largely their locations on wind. So any new additions of wind wouldn't be as optimized as where they currently have wind, but on solar there's quite a bit slated to come into the queue. No coal and only a little bit of gas, and so really the only other potential energy source out there would be small nuclear that unfortunately just the federal government's not moving fast enough to kind of green light those and get them up and going.
Yeah, and that's too bad because nuclear, and it's mainly just because nuclear from a PR standpoint, just never has gotten past 3 Mile Island, and what was that movie called? The China Syndrome?
And Fukushima, and so those impediments, and then HBO a couple of years ago did a great one on the Ukrainian disaster, and so those types of deals just kind of swim. It's hard to swim against that.
It really is. It's just terrible. So let's go to this week, though. I mean, this past week, I guess the big news, as far as I can tell, was about committee chairs in the House, and as a side aspect of that, the fact that Democrats are getting fewer chairmanships this time than they did last time. What's that all about?
Well, as many people may not remember, but there was a little trip to Washington, D.C. to avoid a quorum. So that happened during the special sessions to avoid some election reforms and other types of measures that the Republican leadership were pushing at the time. And there was a quorum break. A large number of Democrats, not all of them, but enough to break the quorum, which essentially is 100 legislators. They went to Washington, D.C., vacated Austin, and so that level of animosity, particularly from chairmen that went to D.C., was real, not only in the members that are there right now, but also in the political parties. As you recall, during the rules debate, the Republican Party of Texas had asked for some rule changes to make sure that the majority party was the only party that held chairs. That rule change ultimately was not adopted. People couldn't, as we said at the time, couldn't quite figure out how to make that work. And thankfully so. We see certainly up in Congress how they run things, and there's quite a bit more bipartisan nature here in Austin. But as a result of the quorum break, there were a significant reduction in the number of Democratic chairs, and in particular, chairs that went to Washington, D.C. were largely removed from continuing to serve as chairs.
Well, I got to say, I mean, I've generally been in favor of having bipartisan chairmen in both houses of the Texas legislature, but there have to be consequences for an action as extreme as that. And I just think it's incredibly unfortunate because that kind of a stunt, and it's not the first time the Democrats have done it, unfortunately, is really more of a Washington, D.C. style of thing than has been traditional in our state. And I just think that there has to be some kind of consequences. So I really can't blame the speaker for taking that action.
Absolutely. And apologies for diverting here, but as the other second priority of the legislature is focused on lunch, and so I'm trying to
That's funny.
Answer one of those text messages, but we'll be right along.
Yeah, I'm getting a bunch of stuff coming in right now too. I'm not sure what it's all about.
I apologize. It's real time when that's happening. But we were very pleased to see some great returning chairmen for energy. It's Craig Goldman out of the Fort Worth area, which did a fantastic job last session and kind of his inaugural time as both a chairman and in energy resources. I've talked to you about Tracy King before out of Uvalde, just a fantastic pro oil and gas Democrat that is doing a great job kind of managing our water resources. This is going to be a great opportunity, as it was in 2013, to really take some budget surplus and invest in water infrastructure. We're excited to be part of a coalition supporting that effort this session. And a number of chairmen returning and new chairmen. So it's going to be a great session now that Speaker Phelan has kind of set the table. And then next week, the preview is Governor Abbott on Thursday, doing his State of the State, not at the Capitol, which is people can't remember when that was the last time that did not occur. But he's going to be in San Marcos. A lot of speculation is that it'll be at the School Safety Center down there at Texas State University. And he'll give his remarks there actually in prime time. It's a 7 p.m. address. It's going to be broadcast largely around the state. Good.
Well, that'll be interesting to hear. Well, speaking of state of the something addresses, the President of the United States gave his State of the Union this week. Didn't talk a lot about energy or oil and gas, but what he did say got a lot of jeers and laughs from the Republican side of the chamber. I don't know, Jason, are we really going to be able to do without oil after just 10 years from now?
After 10 years, I guess that's a little reprieve because initially his campaign said that we were done in 2030. So we've got an additional 3 years. It was remarkable to see the kind of pre-printed comments that they had, and really he was just going to comment on kind of the windfall profit tax idea, which Jimmy Carter is back and in full swing in Congress. But then he kind of ad-libbed a little bit and talked about, I guess we'll need oil and gas for 10 years, and then the jeers, and then he said, well, maybe after that, and got a little muddied. And
he said it like he was being generous, like they ought to be happy with that, right?
Yes. That is a bizarre belief system, but it is widely held. Unfortunately, I've been at the Capitol a lot these past 2 weeks, and talking with younger staffers and new elected officials, and they frequently will ask the same thing. Well, isn't this industry going away? And then I have to point back to them and say, well, how are you going to fund schools, and how are you going to fund roads if we're going away in 7 years? Because you simply do not have the mechanisms in place to raise the revenue necessary to pay for the basics that state government is required to provide. Oil and gas is going to be around for a long time, as Secretary Granholm pointed out in EIA data. They only project out to 2050, and that's probably pretty smart. But they see growing demand for oil and gas, both
Yeah.
here in the United States and around the world through 2050. And so that's really, as much as we like to object to EIA data and IEA data sometimes, it's pretty helpful third-party data to point to and say, look, here's some basic facts on the direction of our planet in terms of energy demand.
Yeah, and I agree. And even the International Energy Agency, the IEA, now projects oil demand's going to grow through 2040. And unfortunately, and I'm not bashing BP, but I have to say it doesn't help when one of the major oil companies, BP, puts out a chart projecting the demand for crude oil to start falling off a cliff in 2030. That supports this notion, and they're a real outlier in making that projection now. And it unfortunately helps to provide a support point for Biden to point to, and it's such a fantasy when you see what's really happening in the world. There's literally no way that's going to happen unless we all decide we want to go back to living a 19th century kind of an existence. And I don't think,
that's right.
maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think a majority of Americans are willing to support that notion. And I guess we'll see in the upcoming elections here over the next.
That's right. I on the BP statistical review, I appreciate the data and wish
too.
that they continued it beyond this year. I think this is the last year, in fact, that they're going to do it. They've been doing it for 100 years. And I believe this year is going to be the last year. So I hope they extend it beyond this year. But you're right. They've been doing these kind of analysis to determine if there's significant climate legislation and governance that would curtail oil and gas demand in a significant way. That would be their accelerated model for the decline of oil and gas. They also provide two other models in their review, and there's zero reporting on those, which is just a kind of business as usual. And so that shows kind of increasing demand and then an assumed flat demand, so capping it at 100 million barrels a day. And then you can work through all of the challenges that then creates. You have significant parts of the world that aren't able to access oil and gas and petroleum products until efficiencies are gained in the developing world, and then can shift those resources elsewhere. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to wait for somebody else in order to help my kids get to school, help my kids go to the hospital and have basic outpatient surgery that we're able to get here. Clean water, clean air. Those are all the things that we enjoy in this country. And absolutely, China, India, parts of Africa are entitled to the same things that we have here. And so that's going to require energy. What is reliable, what is affordable, what is abundant. Unfortunately, it's not the widgets that are coming from wind and solar. It's oil and natural gas.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's kind of crazy listening to that speech. So let's go back to the session, though. That was enough of that. But so any new bills get filed here recently that y'all are particularly focused on, related to oil and gas or energy?
Yeah, we're excited to start to see some meat getting put on the bone, if you will, for promoting oil and gas. And then on the flip side, I've worked quite a bit this week trying to at least register opposition to some bills that are trying to micromanage or overregulate the oil and gas industry. And I guess I could start there. Flaring, no one likes flaring. Certainly anyone in the oil and gas industry doesn't like flaring. And there's been a lot of efforts, both in Texas, but nationally and globally, to address flaring. Start globally, the World Bank has had a partnership for the past 5 years or so that is committed to reducing routine flaring. And most of certainly the integrated companies, but most of the large producers in the world have signed on to the World Bank's pledge to end routine flaring.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, you have the Environmental Partnership, a great program out of API and some of the larger independents that have committed to funding the basic research and applications necessary to tackle environmental issues, and flaring and air emissions are right at the top. And then here in Texas, we have the Texas Methane and Flaring Coalition, which has had great success in its short time period, updating some key rules and forms at the Railroad Commission, publicizing best practices, and then advocating for continued leadership in that space. And so we think that progress has really shown, and there's no question that the legislature has taken positive action, both in terms of eminent domain last session. When we can't get pipelines out of the field, then we have interruptions due to third-party activity, or simply not the capacity to move that gas in an efficient manner. And so the legislature really took great steps last session to improve the eminent domain process in the state. They've also done a good job of funding the Railroad Commission, both in terms of inspectors, but also in terms of data. And unfortunately, this is a lot of data, and it requires upkeep and maintenance. When I was at the Railroad Commission a few years ago, it was 4 terabytes of data that was being maintained on the mainframes. It's only grown substantially from there, and that requires a lot of investment by the state to make sure that that data can be accessed. And really key to this process has been the transparency aspect of it. Companies are competing with each other and with their shareholders to demonstrate that they are reducing their emissions. And that requires both their internal data, but also third-party and governmental verification of that data. So it's been a substantial drop in flaring since the peak numbers we saw just a few years ago. So we've been working against some of those measures this week. On the positive side, we're happy to see some bills really clarifying some geothermal interest in the state and some potential opportunities there. We've also seen a new proposal for kind of an enhanced oil recovery tax credit for shale wells. The horizontal wells that really have led the shale revolution here started in Texas, in the Barnett, and then quickly into the Eagle Ford and then the Permian Basin. There's not existing tax mechanisms in place to attract added investment back into those fields, back into those wells. And so we've seen some new proposals in that space, and we're excited to support those.
So would an enhanced oil recovery tax credit for shale include refracs?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
So refracturing that formation to potentially get some more production out of it.
Right.
Seems like a potentially new opportunity for the Eagle Ford, for the Barnett, and then as some of these older Permian wells, the horizontal drilling's really only been applied to the Permian in the last 5 years. As they start to age and that production decline curve drops, then maybe they would be eligible for some of this added investment.
Yeah, I remember being laughed at in the early days of the Eagle Ford shale development when I would talk about that subject, about, when people would raise the fact, these wells are all going to play out in 5 or 10 years. I would talk about, well, you know what, they probably end up going back in and refracking them at least once and maybe more than that. And so it's good to see that process now beginning to be put into practice to extend. I mean, these wells might produce another 10 years with the second frac jobs. So
That's right.
it's just a great way to extend the life of the formation. What about next week? What's going to be happening next week in the session?
Well, the big thing is going to be Thursday with
Yeah.
the State of the State address, and it's not just a speech by the governor. He really lays out emergency items, and that allows for the legislature to get kind of a jump start on some key items. We speculated before the call with it being in San Marcos and the school safety center located there at Texas State University is probably the setting for that, although it don't have kind of confirmation, but I would imagine school safety and kind of hardening of our schools would be a key aspect of that, particularly after the tragedy in Uvalde last year. I think water. I think I saw an announcement this morning that there's going to be a call for added parks investment. I'm actually headed to a state park this weekend, and so Texas is truly blessed. We have the second most park acreage in the United States, second only to Alaska. But we increasingly have more and more of our population in kind of that golden triangle, the DFW area to San Antonio to Houston. And there's fewer parks in those areas. And so certainly the governor wants to prioritize some new investment there.
Good.
As I mentioned earlier on the call, I'm hoping water is a key part of that, and maybe a call for some water investments. And then tax relief. When you're sitting on $32 billion, it doesn't make sense to hold that in the state treasury. It really needs to be returned to the economy, and so hopefully there'll be some tax relief also as part of that.
I think they almost have to do that, don't they? Isn't there a limit on how much they can leave unallocated?
Well, unfortunately, they regard it as spending, but yes, if they don't spend it, it would then flow to the rainy day fund. And as we've talked about before, the rainy day fund has a cap on it, so that it would flow back into GR, but with some strings attached. When it goes back to GR, it has to go towards welfare spending, and there's not much in terms of welfare spending in the state of Texas, and so I think lawmakers would be disinclined to allow that to happen. So they're going to need to take some proactive steps to really make sure it gets returned to taxpayers in some form or fashion. And whether that's sales tax or property tax reduction or some credit on your electric bill or gas bill, they'll kind of figure out how to push it out.
Ooh, I could use the credit on my electric bill I got yesterday, man. Holy cow. Those rates have gone up.
Electric and gas. I mean, unfortunately, the cost that was involved in Winter Storm Uri is just now starting to hit bills. Last session, they allowed for essentially utilities to borrow from the state to pay that cost back over time, and it's paid for by you and me, every ratepayer in the state of Texas, for the next 20 years. And so I would imagine there'll be some review of that again this session to say, okay, is this an opportunity not only in addition to tax relief, but to pay down some of our debt that was incurred last session and sessions before that?
Yeah, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I wouldn't object. What else? Anything else before we go?
Oh, I think that's probably it. The big items for both the House and Senate right now are the budget process. And so Monday, actually, Article 6 is up in Senate Finance. And so you'll find me and a bunch of other trade associations there advocating for Railroad Commission funding, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality funding, and then the Water Development Board. And then later in the week, many of us will be back for the Public Utility Commission and some of those other regulatory agencies that will pop up later in the week. So that'll keep us busy on the Senate side on Monday.
Boy, you have all the fun, Jason, sitting in those PUC meetings. Holy cow. I'm glad to be semi-retired. I gotta be honest.
Well, if anyone's bored and needs some sleep aid, yeah, just tune in. Sometimes those hearings can go late into the evening.
Yeah, they sure can. Okay, well, let's cut it there. We're half an hour in. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you, Jason. Have a great week next week, and we'll talk to you again next Friday.
Thank you.